Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Midnight Mormons. I am your host, Cardinellis, and today I am joined in the studio via Zoom by some really good buddies. We got Dan, the Physiognomy Man, and Brad Whitbeck with us, and we will be discussing this really interesting question that that was put, in English you say you put forth a question. I can't remember. In Spanish you say hacer la pregunta, but whatever. Anyway, so we had this really interesting question, and Dan, I want to know you and Brad's thoughts on this. Swenson Bailey said, question, which theory is right? There are two theories in LDS thought. God the Father is an infinitely regressing chain of gods, or God the Father is the head God, the God above all other divine beings. There is no regression of gods. Which is right? In the pre-show, you mentioned something about not Joseph Smith, but like W.W. Phelps or McConkie saying like Jehovah became God 2.5 billion years ago or something. Just hit it. Like, just tell me what's up. How old is God? How long has this been going on? Is there any modern revelation thereof? I don't even know what I'm asking here other than for you to just enlighten us as to all of this. What do you think, dog?
Great question. So, Cardin, what happened was W.W. Phelps was having a conversation with Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith apparently said that the consciousness of Jehovah, the spirit of Jehovah, became deified roughly 2,555,000,000 years ago. And it's interesting because someone later on figured out, it may have been Bruce R. McConkie, most likely figured out that is the length of time that equates to 7,000 years on Kolob. So in God's time, 1,000 years on earth is one day to God. So 1,000 years or 7,000 years would be 2,555,000,000 years in earth time.
Okay, so now, before you go any farther, because this is fascinating, this is awesome, and I was unaware of those quotes. I know in our church sometimes things get sticky because prophets are allowed to have opinions and they're allowed to suppose things, just like, I suppose which one of the fantasy football players on my dad's roster is going to win this year. It doesn't necessarily mean that's a divinely inspired observation. I have the same access to information that everybody else my age does. When Brigham Young talks about, green men on the moon, that was during the great moon hoax conspiracy or whatever it was called. So it's not surprising that he had different opinions and theories on whether or not ancient civilizations existed on the moon, so on and so forth. Is this something that you think is like legit and actually based in some kind of divine science or divine reality? Or are we just dusting off old journals from people that might have remembered what he said as he was just thinking this? I mean, do you get where I'm going here, bro?
Totally. Like, okay. All the prophets have speculated, and we're not exactly quite sure what was, received from some angel, what came from the Holy Ghost, what came from the Lord Almighty himself. But I'm inclined to believe that it's some kind of revelation. And the whole point of the message is that there are millions of earths, and that our souls are billions of years old, and that God has been doing this process for billions of years.
Okay, because we know the whole many worlds hath I created thing. All right. And with the concept of eternal progression, now, first off, we have to accept the fact that, as four-dimensional beings, how could we ever understand the fifth dimension? It's almost impossible to explain. So in a certain way, this is kind of a fool's errand. But this is a good question. We always talk about God the Father, and we believe as man is now, God once was, and as God is now, man can become, and there's this eternal progress. But that does beg the question, is God the Father like one link in a chain of infinitely going on gods, right? Or is he kind of like the head God and we're all just progressing underneath him, and we're all going in this together like 7 cars in a line that all start going at the same point during the green light, or are those actually kind of the same question because they all mush together in the eternities? And if they do, what are those eternities like? And is there an actual comparison? Can you say 1,000 years of God's time 1,000 years of earth time is like 1 year unto God, or a twinkle of God's eye, or whatever those quotes are? Or is that just them trying to be poetic?
I think it's a little bit of both. Especially when it comes to stuff like Isaiah.
Okay.
I think whenever you're asking yourself in Isaiah, is this literal or figurative? The answer is almost always like, yes. There's layers and layers to Isaiah. And so like, I think the question that you're bringing up from someone who was watching kind of deals with a phrase in Isaiah where God says, before me there was no God and there shall not be any after. Right?
Rock on.
Which is interesting because there are quite a few places in the Bible where it says like one of the commandments is that you should have no other gods before you, which implies that you could have other gods before God, right? At least the way you put them before you.
Oh, yes,
and then
exactly.
We're also going to be joint heirs with Christ, able to take up godhood the same way he did. So there's a couple of things that like muddy what Isaiah says here and make it so that it doesn't necessarily make sense unless one thing that I've wondered about here is, does this have to do with our eternity? So the quote that Dan was referencing earlier, the 7,000 years of God, has to do with an eternity, which is a time span that we can't even begin to fathom as humans, right? And with God's ways being higher than our ways, right? With his view, he's the Lord of eternity. Eternal is his punishment. The Doctrine and Covenants talks about this. And it makes me wonder if some of these things are to deal with just the eternity that we're in right now.
Okay.
And in eternities before, who knows where God was and where Christ was and how all of these things came together. Because honestly, those are things that we can't know and are beyond our scope of understanding here and now, right? That those are the kind of things that we'll be able to learn at the end of this eternity when we become more like God.
Dude, my brain's starting to hurt. Dan,
so
where does he go wrong?
Where is this going wrong? So here's a main idea that I'd like to bring up is that for us, like there's a time dealing with man's time, angels' time, prophets' time, and God's time, where everything is relative. So a great point that I was thinking of was that imagine how long a day feels to a bug, like a fly or something.
Okay.
A day feels like years.
Okay.
So if you're at a lower form of life, or even if you're less wise or if you have less experience, like imagine how long a day felt when you were like 5 or 6 years old. Do you remember? Like a day went on forever. Like, do you remember like maybe going on a drive like for 4 or 5, 8, 9, 10 hours? It was never ending.
Yeah.
And so that's something that happens, even over the course of our mortal lifetimes, time speeds up.
So the relativity of time relative to your age?
Yes. Or lived experience or lived memories. So one thing that the veil does is it makes time feel very slow. It slows down the clock. Because I'm sure before this life, if we were spending, in the premortal existence, if we were spending millions of years doing different activities, I'm sure 1,000 years would have gone by very quickly. And that's one way where maybe God is able to predict or see the future so well, is because you would say it's very easy to predict what's going to happen in 1 second. Now, 1 second for God is like a year of like Earth time. For him, it's immediately present.
Oh, interesting.
Dude,
which
that's
frees
cool.
up the foreknowledge of God,
yes,
while allowing for us to still have agency.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's like everything is in slow motion.
I've never thought of it that way, but that is intriguing.